In sexual terms, a fetish or erotic fetishism is an intense attraction to a non-genital object, body part, or situation that is used to achieve sexual arousal. In other words, something most people consider ordinary, like a type of clothing, a material, or a body part such as feet, become a primary source of excitement. Fetishes can range widely from common ones like feet, shoes, and leather to very specific or unusual items. Importantly, having a fetish by itself isn't considered a disorder, it's a variation of human sexuality that has been documented across history and culture. But how did this human behavior come about? The word fetish didn't originally refer to sexual behavior at all. It comes from the Portuguese fetico, meaning charm or sorcery, and was adopted by early anthropologists and philosophers to describe objects believed to have mystical and spiritual powers. In the 18th century, for example, philosopher Charles de Broussais used fetishism to discuss African religious idols, physical objects worshipped for their supposed magic. This concept fascinated thinkers and even influenced Karl Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, which refers to economic goods that are mystified. Over time, the term was applied metaphorically to sexual contexts. Just as a tribal fetish objects had power, a sexual fetish object held a sort of erotic power. Ancient philosophies per se did not discuss fetishism in the sexual sense, but they certainly grappled with human desires and perversions. The Greek myth of Pygmalion who falls in love with a statue he carved can be seen as an early tale of object fetishism. In other cultural contexts, Hindu mythology suggests fetish-like fascinations. An 8th century text describes the god Brahma becoming aroused at the sight of the goddess Parvati's feet. These examples showed that fixating sexually on a particular body part or object is not a modern invention. Ancient peoples, whether in the East or West, were aware that certain odd turn-ons existed. However, they likely viewed them through a spiritual and moral lens as blessing, curses, or perhaps divine quirks, rather than a medical one. The philosophical interpretation of unusual sexual behavior were often intertwined with religion and morality. Moving forward to the medieval and early modern eras, unconventional sexual behaviors, what we now call fetishes, weren't studied scientifically. They were mostly hidden or lumped under broad sins. Non-reproductive sex acts were often condemned by religious authorities. A man obsessed with shoes or a woman deriving pleasure from an object would have had to keep it secret or risk being seen as a deviant. It wasn't until the 19th century that fetishism became an object of scientific inquiry. In the late 1800s, pioneer sexologists began documenting and defining these behaviors. The term fetishism was first used in a sexual context by French psychologist Alfred Binet. Soon after, Dr. Richard Kraft-Ebing included fetishism in his famous 1886 study Psychopia Sexualis. These early sexologists described men who could only become aroused in the presence of certain objects like boots or handkerchiefs, and tried to explain how such fixations develop. Havelock Ellis believed that fetishes stemmed from associative learning. Essentially, some early sexual experiences accidentally linked arousal with the object or feature. At this time, fetishism was seen as a male phenomenon and as a perversion or mental aberration. Still, the very act of studying it signaled a shift. People were moving from purely moral judgments to trying to understand unusual sexual desires. By the 1950s and 60s, fetishism was an official diagnosis in psychiatry listed among sexual deviations. Into the modern era, understanding of fetishes continued to evolve from the late 20th century to today. In 1980s DSM, the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, refined the definition of fetishism, initially even excluding body parts. This distinction was later dropped, and current manuals group body part fixation and object fixations together under fetishistic disorder. The key change has been a move from viewing all fetishes as a pathological to recognizing that many fetishes are otherwise healthy and happy. Society's attitude has also shifted. What was once hidden in the shadows or only discussed in clinical case reports became more visible in pop culture and subcultures. Fetish communities and events such as leather or latex conventions emerged by the late 20th century, especially in Western cities, giving like-minded people safe spaces. The rise of the internet in the 1990s and 2000s then allowed fetish enthusiasts around the world to connect easily. One analysis of online fetish forums found that most common fetishes involve body parts, especially feet, and objects related to the body like shoes, which together accounted for over 60% of fetish content. By the 21st century, studies like these and large surveys began to challenge the old notion that fetishes are exceedingly rare. Instead, they appeared to be a minority but significant thread in the fabric of human sexuality. In summary, over time, we've gone from treating fetishes as occult oddities or moral sins to cataloging them as medical perversions, to finally understanding them as one natural variation of sexual expression, with a focus on consent and personal well-being. But how do these variations of sexual expressions evolve in us? Why would fetishes exist evolutionarily? It might seem counterintuitive after all. Being aroused by an object or odd stimulus doesn't directly help one reproduce. Evolutionary scientists don't believe fetishes were directly selected for as adaptive traits, but rather a side effect of how flexible and broad human sexual learning can be. Humans and other animals have the ability to associate pleasure with various cues. This is useful for bonding with partners and adapting to different environments. However, that same ability means sexual imprinting can sometimes latch onto a non-traditional stimulus. In evolutionary terms, as long as a fetishistic individual still mates and has offspring, there's no strong pressure against these traits. Some researchers point out that imprinting and critical periods in sexual development might play a role. During childhood or puberty, a person's brain might subconsciously decide what is sexually exciting, based on random exposure or experiences. If a particular object or situation coincidentally accompanies one's early sexual arousal, the brain's wiring might incorporate that as a turn on. There's also evidence that humans aren't alone in this tendency. Pathologists have long noted that animals can develop seemingly quirky sexual preferences under certain conditions. For example, if a male bird is raised in isolation with a particular object present during mating time, he might later court that object instead of a real mate. In primates, too, researchers have observed behaviors that resembles fetishes, such as monkeys who are fixated on certain toy objects for sexual stimulation. These parallels hint that the roots of fetishistic behavior lie deeper within our biological heritage. One theory even suggests that fetishes could be supernormal stimuli, an idea from evolutionary biology. A supernormal stimuli is an exaggerated version of a natural stimulus that animals find irresistibly appealing. In humans, an object that accentuates a sexual cue might trigger outsized attraction. For instance, high heels exaggerate the arch of the foot and the sway of the hips. Evolutionary psychologists have argued that this makes them a supernormal signal of feminine gait. Similarly, materials like latex or leather may enhance a visual or tactile aspect of skin, tapping into primal sensual responses. In essence, our evolutionary inheritance gives us a sexual brain that is curious and plastic enough to learn which is great for adapting complex social mating. But it also means sometimes the wiring connects in idiosyncratic ways. Human sexuality doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's heavily influenced by culture. What one society views as a normal erotic interest, another might label a perversion, and vice versa. Cultures determine attitudes towards sexual behaviors, and likewise towards what objects or body parts become fetishistic turn-ons. Anthropologists and sexologists have noted that fetishistic practices tend to reflect a culture's symbols and taboos. If a certain body part is usually hidden or invested with special meaning, it's more likely to become a focus of obsessive interest. For example, in Victorian Europe, women's ankles and feet were nearly always covered by clothing, which perhaps contributed to the era's flourish of foot and shoe fetishes, since a glimpse of the ankle was a forbidden thrill. By contrast, a tribe that goes mostly nude might rarely develop a foot fetish, because feet are openly visible and mundane. Comparative study in 2020 suggested that characteristics of a culture such as sexually conservative or permissive it is influence not only the reporting of fetishes, but possibly the prevalence of fetishes themselves. In more repressive, sex-negative societies where sex is seen purely for procreation, paraphilias including fetishes may actually be less common or at least less often acted upon. In sex-positive cultures that view sexual pleasure as natural, fetishistic interest might flourish more freely. It's a tricky chicken and egg situation. Do cultures have certain fetishes because of their norms? Or do they have certain norms because of a collective fetish? Modern science has started uncovering biological cues about why fetishes occur. One fascinating finding comes from neuroscience. The layout of our sensory cortex may be predisposed for certain fetishes. Whilst looking at a map of body areas in the cortex, we can notice that the feet and toe regions lies adjacent to the genital region, suggesting neural crosstalk could link foot sensations with sexual arousal. Pioneering neurologist Ramchandran pointed out that the brain's touch map and these areas processing sensations from the feet sit right next to the areas for genital sensation. He theorized that in some people, the wiring in this region might overlap or bleed over, so that stimulating the feet can trigger erotic feelings similar to genital stimulation. This could explain why foot fetishes are among the most common. Essentially, a little neuronal glitch that turns an ordinary foot rub into something sexually charged. It's a compelling hypothesis that links a specific fetish to brain anatomy. Biological research also shows that fetishes can sometimes arise due to changes in the brain. For example, there are documented cases of people developing unusual sexual fixations after a neurological injury or diseases. One famous report tells of a man who had a lifelong fetish for safety pins, but after undergoing surgery, a temporal lobe removal to treat epilepsy, his safety pin fetish vanished completely. This suggests that his fetish might have been sustained by some epileptic-related brain activity, and when that was cut out, the fetish dissipated. Another case involved a person whose Parkinson's disease medication, which floods the brain with dopamine, led him to develop multiple new fetishes and hypersexual behaviors that he never had before. When the medication dose was reduced, those fetishes faded. Such cases highlight the role of brain chemistry. Dopamine and other neurotransmitters modulate sexual desire, and an imbalance can lead to atypical targets for that desire. There may even be a genetic or developmental factors that make someone more prone to form fetishes. A study in 2014 noted that people with certain neural development conditions like Tourette's or obsessive compulsive traits showed higher rates of unusual sexual interest, including fetishes. This doesn't mean that fetishists have a brain disorder. Rather, subtle differences in brain circuits for reward, arousal, and conditioning could tip one person's toward fetishism, while another person under the same external conditions remains indifferent. A fetish might start with a chance experience, but whether that fixation sticks could depend on a person's neurobiology, how strongly their reward circuits encodes that link, and how easily their brain can be conditioned. As research continues, we'll learn more about the biological underpinnings of these fetishes. But one thing is clear: fetishism is not just in the mind, in the sense of pure imagination. It also lives in the networks of the brain and the hormones of the body. If biology is the hardware, psychology is the software shaping fetishism. Psychologists have proposed many theories for how and why fetishes develop, each highlighting different aspects in the mind. Let's break down some major perspectives. First, psychoanalytical theories. Early psychoanalysts viewed fetishes as a manifestation of unconscious conflicts, while modern psychology doesn't put that much stock in the literal specifics of Freud's view. The general psychoanalytical stance is that fetishes are symbolic. They may represent a person's memory or repressed fear and desire in disguise. Later analysts like Otto Fischler and built on Freud, suggesting that fetishes, specifically for objects, serves to reassure the fetishist by symbolically restoring what was felt to be lost, thus calming deep anxieties. In this lens, a fetish isn't random. It has an emotional meaning traceable to early development, often related to one's parents or early caregivers. These theories are hard to prove, but they offer a rich narrative for patients who seek therapy for fetishes. On the behavioral conditioning side, perhaps the simplest and most evidence-backed explanation is that fetishes are learned through classical conditioning. Just as Pavlov's dogs learn to salivate at the bell by associating with food, a person can accidentally associate an object with sexual arousal. Laboratory studies support this. Men have been conditioned to become aroused at images of boots, geometric shapes, or even arbitrary objects by pairing those images with erotic imagery or stimulation. In these experiments, participants who initially had no unusual turn-on developed a measurable arousal to the new fetish objects. After repeated pairing, such results strongly indicated that human sexual responses is additive and associative. However, conditioning alone might not explain lifelong persistent fetishes. As noted by researcher John Bancroft, most people encounter random stimuli during sex and don't end up with fetishes. Conditioning likely lays the groundwork, but something about the person or the context causes that association to cement and magnify. Fetishists often develop elaborate fantasies around their fetish object over years. These mental rehearsals reinforce the attachment. Some have speculated that people prone to fetishes may have personality traits like high openness or even a tendency toward obsessive focus, which makes them imprint and stick and grow with this fetish. In support, surveys find many fetishists remember specific childhood moments connected to their fetish, like being fascinated by a woman's boot at age 6. Finally, most modern psychologists agree no single factor explains fetishism. It's likely a mix of learning, psychology, and biology unique to each individual. A useful way to view fetishes is through this biopsychosocial model. Biologically, One might have a certain arousal wiring or temperament. Psychologically, one experiences conditioning or trauma, and socially, one's culture and circumstances either discourage or encourage the fetish. In fact, studies finding relatively high prevalence of fetishistic interest call into question the very notion of what is normal desire. As long as an interest is consensual and doesn't harm anyone, then we should consider it paraphilia, a neutral term for unusual interest, rather than a pathology. Fetishism, in particular, is often benign and compatible with an otherwise typical love life. Many fetishists have relationships where their partner either shares or consensually accommodates this fetish. In closing, the journey of fetishism from ancient altars to modern bedrooms exemplifies the broader journey of human sexuality, ever-changing, richly complex, and shaped by a mosaic forces. Ultimately, embracing a nuanced view of fetishes is part of embracing the full diversity of who we are as sexual beings. Thank you for watching.